There is a moment, somewhere south of every shipping lane on Earth, when the ocean stops being water and starts being something else. The temperature drops below what your body understands as survivable. The waves stretch taller than houses. And the men who work that water, the ones who spend entire winters out there, will tell you that on the stillest nights, something pale rises just beneath the hull and watches them back. Before you hear another word of this story, sit with that image for a second. A shape the size of a bus, holding perfectly still in freezing black water, facing up toward the light of a ship. Because that image is the reason this legend refuses to disappear no matter how many times science shrugs it off. This video is about that shape. The fishermen and researchers who claim to have seen it call it the Ningen, a word that in Japanese does not mean monster, does not mean beast, does not mean anything from the old sailors' vocabulary of krakens and sea serpents. It simply means human being. And once you understand why they chose that word instead of any other, you start to understand why this story has survived for 2 decades of ridicule, debunking, and outright dismissal. We are not going to tell you the Ningen is scientifically confirmed, because it isn't. No specimen has ever been recovered. No institution has ever certified a photograph. But we're going to walk through exactly what witnesses claim to have seen, exactly what the Southern Ocean is capable of hiding, and exactly why, even now, new accounts keep surfacing from people who insist they had never heard the word before the night it happened to them. To understand why anyone would believe a giant pale humanoid swims beneath Antarctica, you first have to understand how little we actually know about the water down there. The Southern Ocean is not like any other body of water on the planet. It wraps entirely around the bottom of the Earth with no landmass to interrupt it, which means the wind has nothing to slow it down and neither do the currents. Storms that would be considered catastrophic anywhere else are simply Tuesday down there. The waves are taller and more sustained than anywhere else on the map. The water is colder and denser than most oceans, and the visibility beneath the surface drops to almost nothing within a few dozen meters. Even with modern satellites and sonar, huge sections of that seafloor have never been properly mapped. We have more detailed photographs of craters on the moon than we do of certain trenches at the bottom of our own planet. That is not conspiracy. That is simply the reality of a place too violent, too cold, and too remote for regular human presence. For most of history, the only people who ever spent real time on that water were commercial fishing crews, whaling operations, and later, small groups of marine researchers on long scientific deployments. These are not casual travelers. These are professionals who measure their careers in seasons spent at sea, who can identify a whale species by the shape of its spout from half a mile away in bad light, who know the difference between drifting pack ice and a living animal without needing to think about it. When people like this describe seeing something they cannot explain, it carries a different weight than a tourist snapping a blurry photo from a cruise ship railing. The stories tend to follow a similar arc, retold across different ships, different decades, and different nationalities, which is itself part of what makes this case strange. It typically begins in that strange gray half-light that hangs over the polar region for hours before true sunrise, a light with almost no color to it, where the sea and the sky and the deck of the ship all blur into the same washed-out shade. A crew member on watch notices something pale sitting low in the water off the bow. His first assumption, every single time, is ice. It is the single most common thing floating in that water, and after enough time on deployment, a man stops even registering it consciously. He glances away to check an instrument or log a temperature reading, and when he looks back, the shape has moved. Not drifted with the current the way ice does. Moved against it. Held a steady line, the way a swimmer holds a line, the way something with intention holds a line. That single detail, movement against the current, is the hinge the entire legend turns on. Ice cannot choose a direction. It goes wherever wind and water push it. It has no will, no destination, no reason to fight the pull of the sea around it. But the witnesses in these accounts insist what they saw did exactly that. It picked a heading and kept it, slow and deliberate, the way an animal swims when it is not in a hurry, but is absolutely going somewhere. A man can talk himself out of a strange shape in bad light. Human brains do that constantly. filling gaps with the most familiar explanation available. What is much harder to talk yourself out of is the impression that the thing you are looking at made a decision. In most versions of the story, the witness does not stay quiet about it. He calls someone else over. A second set of eyes joins him at the rail, sometimes a third, and now there are multiple people, cold and awake and sober, staring at the same patch of black water and seeing the same impossible shape glide past the hull. That detail matters more than people give it credit for. A single tired man seeing something strange in the dark is easy to dismiss. Multiple experienced crew members independently agreeing on the same shape, the same movement, the same wrongness in the same moment is a different category of claim entirely. And what these witnesses describe when they finally put into words is unsettling specifically because of how anatomically deliberate it sounds. Not a formless blob, not a vague pale mass, but something with parts, and the parts arranged the way a body is arranged. A rounded bulk at the top, sitting the way a head and set of shoulders sit on a person standing with their back turned. Long pale limbs trailing down from that bulk into the dark water below. Some accounts describe those limbs ending in something even more specific. 5 distinct digits spread out in the water, occasionally opening and closing, the way a person flexes a stiff hand in the cold. That is the detail that tends to end conversations. A strange shape can be explained as ice. A hand that opens and closes is much harder to file away as coincidence, because a closing hand implies muscle, implies control, implies a nervous system making a choice. The accounts do not fully agree beyond that point, which is itself interesting rather than damning. Some witnesses describe 2 long limbs trailing beneath the torso, kicking slowly the way a swimmer treads water, essentially describing an entire human silhouette scaled up to enormous size. Other witnesses, on different ships in different years, describe something else entirely below the shoulders, not legs at all, but a single smooth, tapering body ending in something closer to a fin, closer to what you would picture if you strapped a monstrous tail onto a human torso. And then there is a smaller, rarer category of report, the ones witnesses tend to describe more quietly and reluctantly, involving the face. Forward-facing eyes, rather than eyes set on the sides of the head like a fish, positioned the way a predator's eyes sit, the way our own eyes sit. In the most unsettling versions, those eyes are described as turning, finding the witnesses at the rail, and holding their gaze for a moment before the shape sinks back beneath the surface. Now, it is worth being completely transparent about where this story actually comes from, because that context changes how you should weigh everything above. Unlike older maritime legends that trace back centuries through ship logs and coastal folklore, the Ningen as a named phenomenon really only entered public awareness in the mid-2000s, spreading through Japanese internet forums late at night, passed from anonymous account to anonymous account. The classic framing repeats itself in almost every early post. Someone knew someone who had worked a long contract on a research or fishing vessel near Antarctica. Someone who came back different, who avoided the subject, who eventually admitted to having seen something they refused to describe in full detail. With every retelling, the story sharpened. New specifics got added. The estimated length crept upward. The hand that opens and closes became a fixed detail rather than a rare one. This is exactly how folklore behaves when it travels through word of mouth and anonymous retelling. And recognizing that pattern does not automatically mean the underlying sightings never happened, but it does mean the legend, as commonly told today, has been shaped and polished by years of storytelling, not preserved untouched from a single original witness. Here is the part that deserves real attention, though, because it is easy to overlook in the middle of an entertaining sea monster story. The name itself is doing enormous work. The moment something is labeled Ningen human being, rather than given a more distancing name like the old word sailors used for sea serpents or krakens, your brain is primed differently. You are told before you have weighed a single piece of evidence that whatever is in that water is not simply an unknown animal. It is something that resembles us. And once that idea is planted, it is very hard to fully remove. You can be told convincingly that it was ice sculpted by wind into a human-like silhouette. You can be told that exhausted crews in disorienting half-light are exactly the conditions under which the human brain manufactures faces and bodies out of ambiguous shapes, a well-documented psychological tendency called pareidolia. And some part of you will still picture a face looking back from the water. That is not a flaw in your reasoning. That is simply how deeply the name itself works on the imagination, regardless of whether the creature behind it is real. So where does the evidence actually stand once you separate the atmosphere from the argument? The case in favor rests mainly on two pillars, and both deserve to be taken seriously rather than dismissed outright. The first is consistency. Separate witnesses on different vessels, in different years, speaking different languages, with no apparent contact with each other, keep converging on a similar description. Pale coloring, enormous scale, a human-like arrangement of a head, shoulders, and trailing limbs. If this were purely random imagination, you would expect far more variation. Tentacles in one account, serpentine coils in another, something entirely alien in a third. Instead, the shape stays remarkably human across tellings, which is either evidence that something real and consistent is being observed, or evidence that the name Ningen itself, once established as the reference point of the legend, shaped every subsequent witness's interpretation of an ambiguous shape in poor light before they ever wrote down what they saw. The second pillar is geography, and this one is genuinely hard to argue with. Deep ocean exploration has repeatedly proven that huge, previously unknown animals exist in remote water. The giant squid was considered a sailor's exaggeration for centuries, until specimens were finally confirmed. Deep-sea sharks capable of bioluminescence have been documented within living memory. New species, some startlingly large, continue to be identified in poorly explored regions of the ocean on a regular basis. Given how little of the Southern Ocean has ever been properly surveyed, it is not unreasonable to say the deep could plausibly be hiding large, undocumented animals we simply have not encountered yet. But could hide is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and it is not the same claim as does hide a 30-meter humanoid. This is where the argument runs into its hardest limitation. The deep ocean conceals things specifically because they stay in the deep, in crushing pressure and total darkness, far below any surface vessel. An animal that size repeatedly surfacing near ships, breathing at the surface, visible in the gray light of dawn, is by definition not staying hidden. Something that large, behaving that way, over the number of years these reports span, would almost certainly have left more than anecdotal accounts by now. It would show up in fishing nets, in sonar logs, in the kind of photographic evidence that modern smartphones and research equipment make nearly impossible to avoid producing. The very thing that makes the deep good at hiding animals is the thing these surface encounters would violate if they happened as consistently and visibly as the legend claims, which leads to the most likely, if far less thrilling, explanation. Wind-carved pack ice can take on remarkably organic shapes, especially in the low, directionless light of the polar dawn, where color and depth cues nearly disappear and everything reads as the same pale, bone-colored haze. Add to that a species of animal we already know exists in that region, like leopard seals or certain whale species, whose silhouette can be badly misjudged at a distance in bad visibility, and combine it with the extraordinary human tendency to detect faces and bodies in ambiguous shapes, a survival trait wired into us over millions of years, and you get a fairly complete, non-supernatural explanation for most of what gets described. The most likely truth is that this legend spreads not because something enormous and human-like is actually patrolling that water, but because the story travels so effectively that once the first teller reached for the word human, every witness after him was primed to see the same thing. None of that fully closes the file, though, and that is precisely why this story keeps returning. It surfaces every few years from a new crew, a new deployment, a witness who insists they had genuinely never heard the word Ningen before the night they stood at that rail. Maybe the reason this legend refuses to die has less to do with whether a creature is actually down there and more to do with what the Southern Ocean represents to us. It is one of the last true blank spaces left on this planet, a place where almost nobody goes and almost nobody watches, cold and vast enough that our imagination can still fill in the gaps however it wants. And of everything that emptiness could produce, The thing we keep imagining is not a random monster. It is us. A shape with our proportions, our limbs, our eyes, staring back from water we were never built to survive in. So that is where the case currently sits. No confirmed specimen. No verified photograph accepted by any scientific body. A name that does more emotional work than any of the actual physical evidence. And yet, decade after decade, new witnesses who swear they saw something enormous, pale, and disturbingly human-like gliding just beneath the surface of the coldest, least explored ocean on Earth. Whether that is the residue of a story too well told to shake off, or a genuine unexplained animal still waiting somewhere in that blank space on the map, is something science has not settled, and for now may not be able to. Tell us honestly what you think actually explains this. Is it simply ice and exhaustion doing what tired minds do in strange light, or is there something down there the textbooks have not caught up to yet? Leave your answer below. And if you want to go further into the edges of the map with us, the next case is waiting.